So I think we actually do have a national emergency, and certainly, policymakers and companies understand that when China shut off access. And so
that was the moment.
I think that was the moment where it really hit that not only over-reliance, but up to 100% reliance. That's like that. I mean, the Chinese cut off access to the technology that they had developed for refining, for extracting. They actually, when we had that 1 year pause, one of the things that the Council on Foreign Relations partner, Silverado Policy Accelerator, they had done a lot of work on what China was actually exporting after that October lifting of the export controls. They're exporting magnets, but they're not exporting those rare earths or the technology that we need to actually produce the same for ourselves.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, we do these episodes on various areas of technology in which China is perceived to be ahead of the U.S. Mm-hmm. They're very interesting, and I learn a lot. It's not obvious to me, what lessons there are or anything. Some of these things is we're really far behind. I don't think we're ever going to catch up. This is very interesting and academic. But what exactly is the point of talking about all this? I don't know if there's anything to do with this information.
You know what I thought you were going to say is that we are sometimes accused of identifying strategic choke points or areas of difficulty on the podcast and then coming up with absolutely no solutions for how to fix them.
I will be the first to admit I have no solutions. If someone accuses me of saying you have not offered any solutions, you know what? I just say, that's not my job. I'm just a mere podcaster. I'm just asking questions.
We enunciate the problem and leave it to others to figure out.
We leave the problem to others to figure out. But there are people who are doing more than identifying choke points. There are people who are identifying areas and vulnerabilities, et cetera. Some people actually are thinking about solutions, so they're not all pie in the sky. I've seen people on Twitter. It's I know how to sort of be more like Chinese, and why don't we just adopt
how to be more? You've seen people on Twitter talking about how to be more Chinese.
Yeah, they just
is it Chinese Joe Weisenthal?
Yeah, they just say why doesn't the U.S. just adopt Marxist-Leninism with Chinese characteristics? It's really that simple,
no.
And then we can do that.
On a serious note, the one you see most often is, why doesn't the U.S. just ease up on some of its regulation, like China, in order to get things done quickly? That's the trope.
Spend more money or something like that. Encourage actors to pursue things that aren't necessarily so short-term, et cetera. Yes, there are, in theory, solutions. Anyway, let's have a conversation in which we actually talk about ideas that may be somewhere in the realm of feasible.
Excellent. I'm ready. And this is on an interesting topic that's come up a number of times on Odd Lots at this point.
That's right. So we're going to be talking about a very core topic. And of course, this is the U.S. vulnerability to sort of strategic minerals, rare earths, et cetera, which we know that China dominates, which in theory, if China were to completely shut off access, not just military, high tech, et cetera, all kinds of problems. So what could actually be done to alleviate this vulnerability? We really do have the perfect...
And China's dominance was also a crucial turning point in the trade negotiations with the U.S. And also, I think you get a sense of, I don't want to say desperation on the U.S. side, but maybe urgency on the U.S. side just by looking at the headlines that seem to come out on a nearly daily basis about we found a huge critical mineral deposit in Utah, so, we're all saved.
It's also worth noting, before we go further, this is an area in which there's probably a decent amount of overlap from the last administration to this one. Yep. We did an episode a little while ago with Peter Harrell, who talked about some of these deals that the administration is making with equity stakes in private companies. I think Vulcan came up as one of them. And so, yes, we're going to be talking about where further we can go in terms of actually having a healthy, robust domestic environment for our own strategic commodities, et cetera. Anyway, we really do have the perfect guest. We're going to be speaking with Heidi Crebo-Rediker. She's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a former chief economist at the State Department, and she is the co-author of a brand new report for the CFR looking at exactly this question: what can the U.S. do in this realm? So, Heidi, thank you so much for coming on the Odd Lots podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Tell us, what is What's this new report all about?
So you're right that everyone's identified the problem, and that it's been a long time coming. This is like a slow train coming at us for decades at this point. It's not a surprise that China has dominated this market for a variety of reasons, and it's not a surprise that they've weaponized it. They've done it over the years. We did pay attention, but we sort of forgot about it in many ways. But right now we have an inflection point where we really need to get this sort of Damocles off of the United States. And actually, it's really our challenge is the same challenge that a lot of other advanced economies have right now with this incredible chokehold, not just on critical minerals, but particularly rare earths, particularly heavy rare earths that are the foundation of magnets, which go in everything.
Can I just back up in history for a second, because I think it will help us contextualize where we are right now. But what were the conditions that allowed China to basically gain dominance in this particular area? Did they make a strategic decision at some point saying, we're going to be the world's not manufacturer of rare minerals and rare earths, but we're gonna make this a priority for ourselves?
Yes, Made in 2025 was their big strategic plan. They had invested a lot in rare earths, particularly their domestic rare earths, to like many years before that. But they decided they wanted to dominate, and they did a very smart job of creating an entire ecosystem. So both domestic China extraction, processing, and then they came up with all of the products that would be the leading demand, which you really need to have for the creation of a market. And the demand meaning the new energy, wind turbines, particularly their EVs, and also defense. So you have a whole demand pull, and you also have state companies that don't have to be profitable, and that's pretty key if you're competing around the globe to actually mine and process. They also have a lockhold on the technology for processing, and so in traditional mining, they've made a massive strategic investment, and we, for a variety of reasons, did not.
Joe, this reminds me of the episode we did with Dan Wong, where he made sort of similar points about the tech ecosystem that's developed around Shenzhen and how that allows innovation to really thrive. And then also this idea that, well, if you don't necessarily care about returns on capital as much as the U.S., certainly, then you kind of have a leg up when you're developing something like this that might not pay off for a very long time.
And this always seems to be an issue when we're talking about some matters of national defense, because when it comes to national security, you have this other priority that is not profit related. Everything that we've done that has every episode we've talked about, this comes up whether we're talking about literally the defense industries and the defense suppliers or other strategic things. Here is this other goal that you have in which profit can't be the only. You have at least two bottom lines. One is related to security and one's related to profit. And so you have this tension. Tell us, how did you do this report? What was the process by which this was, you researched this? Who did you talk to, et cetera, so that you could publish this?
So the report itself is on how, while we put all of the emphasis on mining, on the extraction, coming up with the processing and the end products, for example, magnets. The thing is, we can't actually outmine, outprocess, and outspend China, certainly not at scale and not in a cost-effective way. So we have basically a huge timing mismatch. Will we get there eventually with friends, allies, all of the different countries that are working on the same problem together? Eventually, but it's going to take a very long time, and we don't really have time. So we looked at how innovation could actually leapfrog the China chokehold on critical minerals and particularly rare earths. And so that was really the starting point. How do you solve for national and economic security in a way that really plays to U.S. strength in innovation? And then when we took a look around, we found there were some really exciting companies that had taken research and development from 15 years ago, and they were ready to scale and starting to scale. And so that was really what the excitement was about.
Just real quickly, when you say you took a look around, what was how did you sort of identify the people? Who did you talk to, and how did you identify the people who pointed you to, look, there's a lot of interesting, genuine science and tech that can be scaled up? How did that process work?
So I started with the national labs because we don't give enough credit to the fact that a lot of the great innovations that come out and are commercialized that we all know and love actually had their origin in our national lab system. It's sort of a national jewel. And so Ames National Lab has this critical material innovation hub. And a lot of the companies that are doing this, like the various types of breakthrough technology, came out of or are working with Ames National Lab. And so I started like poking around from there, and then really word of mouth. So as soon as we got the word out that we were working on this, it's a very enthusiastic, mission-driven community that wants to all leapfrog this challenge through innovation.
Plus, people like talking about their problems, right? Describe for us the state of the U.S., I guess, rare earths industry at the moment, and then also what you would describe as the key choke point in this particular strategic choke point. Like, where is the biggest source of trouble or inability to actually do this at scale?
So in terms of, there are two different parts. The U.S. used to produce a significant amount of rare earths, primarily light rare earths. MP Materials in Mountain Pass Mine had a variety of challenges, including not being commercially viable, but that was not the only reason. But we do actually have rare earths in the United States, and we were a mining powerhouse many years ago. I mean, remember like California 49ers and people going out with picks and shovels.
Oh, yeah, many years ago.
So we do have mines and we have resources, but there are always consequences and trade-offs. To mine is often toxic. You have environmental concerns. You have a lot of waste that through traditional mining gets generated. So we were more than happy for the Chinese to take on those set of problems and then sell them to us at a very low cost. That's how we all became dependent on them. And so that is, I think, where we are right now. We do have a lot of partnerships that are being formed. And, with Saudi, with South Korea, Australia, I mean, we're sort of doing what we can to go the traditional mining route. But I think the really interesting thing is how we can get there like much faster, much cleaner, and with much more cost effectiveness and even cost competitiveness with China through some of these new technologies, mining in the U.S.
Let's talk about them. When you talk about the technologies that could actually get us to parity or something like that, are they more on the mining side? Are they more on the refining side, or both? Like, let's talk about these technologies.
Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples. So back when China cut off Japan's rare earth access in 2010, the Department of Energy, through its, people don't know ARPA-E generally. They think of DARPA, but Department of Energy has its own research grant facility, and they do big problems and put them out there. So they did this in 2011. They sprinkled around a lot of grant research funding for materials that you could create a magnet with that did not require rare earths. And lo and behold, a company in Minnesota, a scientist in Minnesota, University of Minnesota, created a rare earth-free magnet. So there's a material design approach to this that either drastically reduces how much rare earths you actually need in magnets. And there's a company called Niron Magnetics that actually it's commercialized, it's scaling, it actually is scaling up massively a new facility in Minnesota. So that's sort of the material engineering approach to it. And then there's this whole other basket of biotech innovations. And, if you want me to go into
Please, yeah.
Okay, so there are companies like Alta Research Technology, and they, again, are affiliated with this Ames National Lab. They have programmed proteins. So those proteins are basically like robots that go into waste, and I'll get to sort of the importance of waste in a minute, but they will go into waste or other types of tailings, things that come out of mines, and they will go in and specifically the protein will target a specific rare earth and extract it.
Wow.
And so it is clean, it's fast. It relies on a very large resource that we have. We have a lot of waste. So it's a domestically sourced resource. There are a number of other, ways that we are in a very clean, fast, and cost competitive way using technology to actually mine waste. And that's actually one of our, it's like we shouldn't consider waste at this point to be a liability. It's literally America's next mine.
So I have a serious question, but first.
First a joke.
First, I'm so curious about the little protein robots.
Yeah,
What
me
does that
too.
process actually look like?
So I don't know what I don't know. I'm not a molecular, technologist and
If any molecular technologists out there listening, that'll be the follow-up episode.
But this is something that's been again long in the making in terms of the tech that's been developed. And so it's basically, that this particular company is commercializing the technology, but it's a protein that is altered so that it can go in and sort of micro target specific rare earth elements. And that is, I think it's kind of revolutionary. It's super disruptive. And the same with all of these companies that were part of this study that we did. They are at the cusp of being ready to scale and scale fast.
All right, this is my next serious question, which is, all of this sounds great. Protein robots sounds amazing. Why aren't we doing this already if the technology exists?
So we're focused on, and this is, this takes a strategy and a strategy that focuses on the innovation side. We're very focused on the how do we compete head on with traditional mining. And that's good and it's important. This is a huge complement to that. We haven't really done it yet. We've done it piecemeal. So you have a lot of people in this community that are highly focused on the technology, commercializing it early stage, and then figuring out how to go from there. I think we have, again, it's a huge opportunity that's out there. When I think about where we are, I think about the shale revolution and how we had fracking technology for like decades, and then we reached a point where that technology unlocked an energy revolution in the United States. And it was like an overnight switch flipped, and suddenly we're an energy giant, an energy producing giant. And so I do feel there's something similar in what we're seeing right now in the technology around critical minerals and rare earths.
I think we could really use a big switch flip to suddenly have abundance. Those don't come along very often. We should. People have to appreciate that more. I'm reading this press release from Berkeley. As reported in Nano Letters, the researchers genetically engineered a harmless virus to act like a, quote, smart sponge that grabs rare earth metals from water and with a gentle change in temperature and acidity releases them for collection. Sounds really cool. I'll have to go watch a YouTube later. Talk to us about one of the themes that comes up in a lot of these conversations is the importance of offtake agreements.
Yes.
So right now, we could American companies, they currently do have access to Chinese rare earths, and so it might be very risky for anyone to invest in these technologies, knowing that at least for the the beginning years before the cost curve has come down, the competitors might be cheaper.
The proverbial valley of death.
Yeah. How do you solve that problem of guaranteeing that there is demand for when these companies release harmless viruses that act like a smart sponge and grab rare earth metals from water?
So first, there has to be, this is not just on government to do. I mean, a lot of people point at the massive, very muscular industrial policy that the Trump administration is using right now. And I think that is a very good thing, but it also takes companies actually coming together more in a consortia type of arrangement to have collective offtake agreements. You have certain companies that have been very forward-leaning in their offtake agreements with certain. Niron is a good case that they have some auto OEMs that have been working with them for years now. You have, Vulcan you brought up earlier, but yeah. Vulcan is kind of the poster child for when you get the technology, the industrial policy, and the commercial all together working to solve. And they actually are, I think they're the first innovation targeted industrial policy scale up, rapid scale up. Vulcan's only 3 years old. They closed their Series A in August. I mean, we're talking about 1.4 billion that they got in a consortium together with a company called Re-Element that recycles magnets. They take the rare earths and they actually manufacture magnets. That is incredibly interesting. They're doing it on a like a super fast scaling time horizon. I think they are aiming for 2027 to start rolling product out, and have been going through the validation process with all of their different types of magnets. So they're doing this on an accelerated basis. They got funded by every branch in the military. So they have a built-in supply, a demand from the U.S. military right there. They also have semiconductor and aerospace. They're really looking to target the national security and the top economic security challenges, and they have the partners to do that. So I think that's a good example of how we want to do this moving forward.
Adjacent to the offtake issue, who actually owns the wastewater that we could potentially be, extracting valuable things from?
So we have lots of different types of waste. So we have coal ash, we have tailings from mines that are still operating where they extract like the super valuable part of and the easy to extract. And then they have all the other mine tailings that just sit there that have a lot of, for example, rare earths in them. We have some really, really toxic areas that are sitting in ponds and provide giving a lot of problems to water supplies. And we have a huge amount of waste that we can draw from, industrial waste that comes from mines where you have primary metals that are extracted, but you have the piles of tailings that sit there on the side because they are either not, there's no commercial viability to extract them, or they are, they're considered piles of waste, both in operating mines and in mines that have closed down. You have coal ash that is, sort of toxic leftover waste from coal mining. You have e-waste, which is, I think, one of the more promising areas. We actually, if you look at old hard drives and cell phones and batteries and the like, there are tons of rare earths that are in there, and actually magnets that are in there from years, when we actually had much greater rare earths, intensity in those magnets before we started to have to scale back. So if you look at the waste ecosystem, we have a lot of domestic opportunity. And that's actually why I think Vulcan is a really good example. They pull from domestic recycled e-waste, and then they process and manufacture magnets in a completely domestic cycle.
Joe, that's interesting about coal ash. I could have been mining my ashes from burning the coal stove in Connecticut that first year, mining them for rare earths. If only I had known.
Yet another missed opportunity to exploit that,
to monetize my natural resources.
To monetize all the natural resources on your land that you had in Connecticut. Let's talk about, so we understand there's various measures and opportunities and resources and technological opportunities and things that work in a lab, things that are already scaling up, et cetera. Talk to us more from a policy perspective. What do we need to do to get from what we already have cooking and what's already in the works to where we feel good about where we are? And does policy, would it need to happen in the form of legislation, or does the government, the federal government as currently constituted, have the cash and the policy levers to pull without new laws being passed?
So policy plays an enormous role. And the first thing we need to do is actually understand that we can't do a fragmented approach to this, because you end up losing innovation that might actually change the chessboard entirely with China. You also have to deal with waste from a policy basis, because we actually don't track waste. It's very hard to find data on how much e-waste the U.S. produces. We ship some of it to Asia, that is very likely fed back into China's massive recycling machine. We shouldn't be exporting. If you consider this as America's next mine, there are ways to address policy that can provide the data, maybe restrict the exports till we know exactly what value is hidden inside all of the stuff that we're exporting, and then come up with a whole strategy that is a critical minerals innovation strategy that sits alongside our other critical minerals strategy, and develop that through not only the policy tools around waste, but also financial tools. Where are the valleys of death? Where do we find them? How can we solve them? How can we use government as a pull to get companies together in consortia to actually have those offtake agreements early on, and also work with the material engineers to design what they're going to need earlier on in the process? There are a lot of good ways to do this. One of the big takeaways is that there is a specific equity valley of death that a venture-like entity could help solve this for, because you don't have the venture outside of some really big frontier, risk takers that will invest in difficult technology. So I think having some kind of a counter that we have now in the in the instruments that DoD has, we have a whole range of different agencies that have all loan-based. They're almost all loan-based instruments, and that's not what this is like. These are tech companies, and they really can't sustain debt. They're not. You need to have that VC come in early on and help them through various series of fundraising, partner with others, bring in other private VCs throughout the process. And we need to, and we do have one of those right now. That is In-Q-Tel. It is not technically, I don't know if you've heard of In-Q-Tel before.
Is that the CIA's VC arm?
It is.
Okay.
Very good. And they are actually, they recognize this gap in the capital structure and the actual ability for these breakthrough technologies to fundraise. And so they actually created a separate fund within In-Q-Tel called their Compass Fund. And they're not just it's not just the CIA. They're a nonprofit. They work for sort of across the intelligence agencies, and they've grown over the past 25 years from what they started out, which was really a very like a boutique VC for solving specific problems for the intelligence world. So they have invested, and actually, going back to one of your earlier questions, how did I find these companies? Well, it ends up that they invested in two companies that I had found through Ames National Lab. And so it was, I think they were extremely helpful in thinking through what the gaps actually were. And we really nailed this early stage VC needing to come from government. It's a market failure. Until we have solved for that market failure, these will just lie on the shelf.
In-Q-Tel has one mission: to be the most sophisticated source of strategic technical knowledge and capabilities to the U.S. government and its allies. That's through capital. That's an interesting one. We should do an episode on it.
We should, for sure.
Okay, so since we're talking about the CIA and you brought up the military earlier, this is going to be a natural segue, I promise. You bring up a historical analogy in your paper, a previous choke point that was militarily very, very significant for the U.S. at a very, very historical time, which we actually managed to solve through industrial policy. How much relevance does that particular analogy have to our current situation?
Well, I love this analogy because as we were contemplating entering World War II, the Japanese cut off the supply chain for natural rubber in Southeast Asia. And we were dependent on this flow for 90% of our rubber.
Right. And we can't grow rubber trees, right?
Rubber came from Southeast Asia for a reason. And what we did was we actually we took technology, synthetic rubber technology, and we scaled it like crazy. So we actually were able to provide for trucks and tanks and everything that rubber goes into that we had never even thought about, but until it was gone. And we were not able to actually enter World War II without the ability to provide something in replacing that rubber supply. And so we did it both through a rapid warp speed Manhattan Project we think of Manhattan Project for the atomic bomb, but at the same time, I think there's a good case to be made that without synthetic rubber, we would not have won World War II. The other side of that was that we did a huge, all of the population should chuck in their extra rubber tires and their raincoats and their garden hoses and whatever you could for the war effort so that we could actually use and recycle rubber that we had already here. So it's a two-pronged, I think, analogy that works.
There are some great posters from World War II about recycling your tires and things like that. Nice graphic design.
I have boxes of old iPhones and stuff that are randomly
recycle them for the rare earth effort.
I bet I have 10 old laptops and random stuff.
And the way that the way that the cycles of upgrades happen. Everybody has tons of old laptops where the software doesn't work anymore, and so this is actually a huge opportunity. So we could actually make it a national priority, and there are ways to do that through government incentives. There are ways that companies can do that through paying for old, unused, unusable technologies and the like, and then have maybe get a government credit. There are a lot of ways you can be creative about getting this entire system to rev up.
You mentioned warp speed just then, and so the obvious thing that comes to mind is also the COVID vaccination efforts. Can these types of programs exist without a coinciding national emergency to sort of galvanize everyone into action? And I totally take it that competing with China is one of those rare areas of bipartisan agreement nowadays. But at the same time, shortages, potential choke points in rare earths has been a long-running issue. We've been aware of it for a while. So far, we haven't really done that much. What's going to galvanize people now and really lend this whole effort a sense of urgency?
So I think we actually do have a national emergency, and certainly, policymakers and companies understand that when China shut off access. And so
that was the moment.
I think that was the moment where it really hit that not only over-reliance, but up to 100% reliance. That's the Chinese cut off access to the technology that they had developed for refining, for extracting. They actually, when we had that 1 year pause, one of the things that the Council on Foreign Relations partner, Silverado Policy Accelerator, they had done a lot of work on what China was actually exporting after that October lifting of the export controls. They're exporting magnets, but they're not exporting those rare earths or the technology that we need to actually produce the same for ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting that they won't export the rare earths, but they'll export the finished material, which is
the end components. Yeah, well, you want to climb the value chain, right?
Well,
and now
they're
just give
doing
away the low margin sales. Do you feel like I mentioned it seems like there is some continuity on some of this stuff from the last administration to this one. Do you, when you're in D.C. talking to people, do you send from on the policy side or on the government side, do you feel that there is a sort of intensity and focus? Because again, when you go back to World War II, one thing I associate with that time is just an incredible amount of focus on solving specific things and coordination. Do you sense that exists right now?
So just as with World War II, there were a lot of officials flagging the fact that we were over-dependent on single sources, or when it was the choke point was the shipping lanes. And there's a huge parallel here. We have, during the Biden administration, one of the first things during the first 100 days, the Biden administration did a resilience study and basically looked at where the choke points were. This was after COVID. It was looking at pharmaceuticals. But one of the big takeaways was that we were so overdependent on China for rare earths and critical materials, critical minerals, that we had to do something ASAP. The Trump administration and Trump 1 also understood that we had this huge vulnerability in critical minerals, and they passed a number of executive orders and tried to sort of get the whole process started for mining, permitting, reducing permitting times, environmental restrictions and timelines, but I think it's a complete parallel with what happened in the run up to World War II. We actually have seen this coming for a very long time, and it wasn't until China shut off the access that the U.S. and Europe kind of woke up to the fact that this is a big problem.
How often do you hear people in D.C. talk about the potential for capital misallocation when it comes to rare earths? Or is the idea of, cylindro with magnets, is that not as much of a looming concern given the urgency of the problem?
I think that the demonization of risk taken on Solyndra has really plagued us for a long time. We have to be much more ready to take risk and be hold hands on a bipartisan basis and realize that this is a big moment where we have to actually take more risk.
So I do love all the analogies we've used in this conversation. So obviously synthetic rubber, but you mentioned fracking before, and a lot of people will concede that fracking was incredibly crucial to America's economic well-being nowadays, and we've become an energy exporter. But at the same time, there's an externality, a negative externality associated with fracking, which is environmental damage. And there's a lot of concern and also controversy about how much impact that actually has. What are the trade-offs that the U.S. would have to think about as we encourage more of a domestic rare earth industry?
So again, there are trade-offs, and I think one of the I'm going to pivot back to the innovation, because I think one of the ways we can do this in a clean way is through some of these new technologies. You were talking about Berkeley and so Rio Tinto is using a proprietary new microbe that they've just started utilizing in some of their old mines in Arizona, where they didn't have the ability to economically extract copper, but using microbes, they are able in a clean way to use a biotech solution to actually extract copper on a cost competitive basis that they were not able to extract. And they're rolling this out right now. They'll be doing it, in the months ahead. And I think it's really noteworthy that you have a large mining company that is taking a plunge into a biotech solution to how to unlock value that they thought the mine was basically it was closed. So we can do that in a way that is clean. We can do it in a way that's fast and cost competitive. And so I think that there are ways to do that with using innovation. I think we need to be very mindful of that, because mining and refining are dirty businesses. That's life. And if we can do them in a cleaner way, then that is a much more sustainable way to actually have an industry moving forward that actually suits the national interest.
You did that biotech VC episode. So much interesting biotech stuff that I never really thought about.
Yeah, I never thought
industrial
mining would be
applications of much more to do on learning about some of the science. One thing you mentioned, the national labs, they're under threat, right? I mean, you talked about them as being this important crown jewel of the U.S. economy, U.S. industry, all these stories about funding cuts, et cetera. What is the intersection there? And from your perspective anyway, are we undercutting our own efforts through some of these budgetary choices?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that we do really, really well. The whole world looks at the way that that DARPA and ARPA-E and the national labs that are associated are actually huge innovation engines. And it's often it's a matter of people coming in, entrepreneurs coming in and understanding what the applications of the science can be to commercialize it. But this is exactly the time where we have to double down on the innovation and the investment in R&D that is not only in the national labs, but also universities, because that's where this is coming from as well. Niron's breakthrough came from the University of Minnesota. So I think you want to make sure that right now in this particular moment, where the solutions can come from biotech as opposed to mining tech. You don't want to be cutting off any channels of investment in R&D right now.
Heidi Crebo-Rediker, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots. Fascinating report. Encourage everyone to go read it and check it out. There are actually some ideas out there, not just people identifying problems. That was great.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Tracy, I really want to learn more about industrial biotech.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, we mentioned it during the conversation, but I feel like there could be tons of interesting episodes on the crossover of that sort of natural science and mining and stuff like that.
Well, I'm looking at a page on Rio Tinto's website right now, and the title is Life Finds a Way, Microbes. And then it says, while dinosaurs vanished, their tiny companions, microbes, adapted and thrived, proving their resilience over time. And now they can be used as some of our most groundbreaking advancements in mining. So
that's pretty cool. Yeah,
exciting.
Let's get a scientist or something on there to talk about microbescience.
I kind of want to see how all of this works, but of course you can't actually see the microbes, so I'll just have to think about it. Just imagine
There's got to be YouTube at least. We could go on the road to some mine, right? I'm sure. And
it's just going to be water passing through a tube.
I know that's
what
it would just look like some water. No, but I thought that was really interesting. I guess I thought, in my mind, when I think about when I thought about the rare earths challenge before, I sort of assumed, I suppose, that, okay, the U.S. probably could overcome our industrial reliance at the cost of a lot of money, basically a lot of loss-making investment, because again, that's the nature of defense. National security is okay. You just have to sometimes spend money, etc. So it's interesting, the prospect that there are technologies that not only could solve perhaps the sort of strategic element, but that actually could be cost competitive, perhaps could create export opportunities, could perhaps also be for profit. That's very interesting, and I hadn't really appreciated that prior to Heidi's report.
Yeah, I think the overall thrust of the report, this idea of like, okay, you're not going to beat China necessarily on its own territory, or you're certainly not going to beat them in the same way that China has developed this industry by, basically ignoring a lot of environmental concerns and things like that. So you have to turn to the U.S.'s own competitive advantage, which is research and development, and also like huge amounts of government capital, which sometimes we have an issue deploying, sometimes we don't. It was super interesting that Heidi described the recent cutting off of China's rare earths as like the moment where people have really realized this is an issue, and so there is the potential to actually galvanize some action.
I have no doubt in my mind that the U.S. has the sort of capacity, the know-how, the science, the natural resources, the money, et cetera, to do it. I only question, of course, whether we have the sort of organizational capacity, and of course, the national research labs are sort of the prime example of the concern. Here is the site with which a lot of these innovations come from. There is this widespread acknowledgement that this is a very serious thing, and apparently, they're seeing their budgets impaired at the same time. Can everyone get on the same page? Can we prioritize things? Can we say, like, no, we want to, like, move in concert? Or do you just have these, like, various, like, political fights and these various factions, et cetera, that are not coordinated, that are not on the same page, that are working at cross purposes? That remains my main source of concern, but perhaps
a legitimate
to your point,
concern, I would say.
Perhaps to your point, maybe there has been some galvanization, and maybe there are some paths here.
Wow, I'm still on this Rio Tinto site.
Yeah, you seeing anything
It's great. They keep making references to Jurassic Park, which is not something I expected from Rio Tinto. But anyway, shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our producers, Kerman Rodriguez at Kerman Armand, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks.
And if you want more Odd Lots content, you should check out our daily newsletter. You'll find that at bloomberg.com/Odd Lots.
And you can join fellow listeners in conversation 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, then please like or leave a comment, or better yet, subscribe.
Thanks for watching.